I had his hands once. Now my skin remembers every touch. That's how it started, even though it wasn't anything yet. It was just a brush of fingertips against a book cover, the faint scent of her perfume drifting past me like it had its own gravity. I was shelving novels in the corner of the downtown bookstore, the late afternoon sunlight hitting the dust motes like tiny suspended galaxies, and she was there, leaning over the counter, trying to read the label on a jar of loose tea. She noticed me before I noticed her, I think. Or maybe I noticed her because she wasn't looking for me at all. She had that way, shoulders relaxed but deliberate, the kind of posture that implied she'd lived long enough to know exactly how to claim a room without a single word. Mid-40s, she'd said once, though we hadn't exchanged names. Her hair, silver streaked just enough to catch the light, fell in soft waves over a sweater that looked expensive without trying. I could tell she wasn't the kind of woman who needed attention to know she existed. I handed her the tea jar when she finally looked at me, because she'd hesitated too long. "Here," I said, my voice breaking slightly. Too loud, maybe. I wanted it to sound casual, but my hands were trembling in a way I hadn't expected. She smiled, just the smallest corner of her mouth, and my chest tightened. It wasn't a polite smile. It was the kind that made the air thinner, like a quiet acknowledgement that she saw me as more than the kid stacking shelves. "Thank you," she said softly, and there was something in her tone, a careful warmth, like she had a secret she could almost tell me if I were patient enough. We lingered there longer than necessary. I shouldn't have been staring at her hands as she placed the jar back on the shelf. They were strong and elegant at once, fingers that could lift, organize, and touch lightly without ever being clumsy. I imagined them resting on my own hand, just for a second. The thought made me flush like a fool. "Do you always organize the fiction section?" she asked, tilting her head. She had this habit of leaning slightly, a tiny motion that somehow demanded attention. I nodded, unsure why she cared, and that's when the pause happened. Neither of us moved. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft scrape of a chair in the distance, the faint smell of old paper, all of it seemed to compress around that silence. And then she laughed, just a little, like she'd caught herself indulging in something she shouldn't. It was a sound that lingered in my chest longer than it should. "I suppose it's a talent," she said, shrugging. But her eyes stayed on me longer than necessary, and that was enough to make my pulse thump like a drum. She left the tea on the counter and walked toward the door, pausing for a moment as if she might say something more. I wanted to ask her to stay, to linger in that silence a little longer, but the words wouldn't form. All I could do was watch the sway of her coat, the gentle tilt of her head, and feel the faint, impossible pull she had on me. And then she was gone, leaving only the faint trace of her perfume behind. I stood there, gripping a book too tightly in my hands, and realized I couldn't stop thinking about how her hand had brushed against mine for just a fraction of a second when she adjusted the jar. A spark, a whisper, something unspoken that insisted it wasn't finished. I had his hands once, but now, more than anything, I wanted to remember hers. I didn't expect to see her again so soon, but there she was, leaning over the counter in the corner of the bookstore where the sunlight had shifted just enough to catch the silver in her hair. She was holding a stack of books that looked heavier than she expected, and I instinctively stepped forward. "Here," I said, sliding one of the lower volumes into her hands. My voice was quieter this time, careful, like I didn't want to break whatever invisible line existed between us. She hesitated, eyes flicking up to mine, and I saw it then, a brief shadow of something behind her gaze. Fatigue? Worry? Maybe both. Her hands gripped the books with a little more force than necessary, knuckles pale. "Thanks," she murmured, voice clipped, almost as if she didn't want to invite conversation. I nodded, noticing the slight tremor in her fingers as she adjusted the stack. We worked side by side for a few minutes, arranging new arrivals. She moved deliberately, quiet, and I found myself watching how her hands hovered just above the shelves before settling. The way she paused mid-motion as if considering whether to take a breath or say a word. Every small gesture felt loaded. "Do you come here often?" I asked, almost against my better judgment. The words sounded foolish even as I said them. She didn't answer immediately, only glanced at me with that faint, guarded expression, lips pressed together. "Not really," she finally said, softer now, almost a whisper. And there it was, the tiny crack in her armor. Her eyes darted down, and I noticed the faint crease at the corner of her mouth, the small sigh that escaped like she wasn't aware of it. Something about that vulnerability made the air between us heavier. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't. I just handed her another book and let my fingers brush hers for a split second. She didn't pull away, but she didn't look at me either. That hesitation, the space between contact and acknowledgement, was enough to make my stomach knot. She laughed softly at something I'd said while placing a particularly awkward stack on the top shelf. It was light, but not careless. It carried a trace of fatigue and something quieter, something almost like relief. I caught the way her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, as if she'd allowed herself that brief moment of ease, then tightened again when her phone buzzed. I wanted to reach out and hold that fleeting softness, but instead I just watched her hands. The way she shifted weight from one foot to the other, the slight line of worry on her forehead. All of it made her more real, more complicated, and impossible to ignore. When she finally turned to leave, she paused at the doorway, glancing over her shoulder. Her gaze lingered on me just long enough to make my chest ache. And then, almost imperceptibly, she smiled. A half-smile that said nothing, yet spoke volumes. And just like that, she was gone again, leaving the bookstore quieter than before. I stood there, fingertips still tingling from the briefest touch, and realized I couldn't stop thinking about the soft weight of her presence, and the strange, forbidden energy she pulled into my chest every time she lingered near. The rain tapped against the tall bookstore windows, a soft, steady drum that made the air feel smaller, more intimate. We were alone, technically, though I wasn't sure who had counted the clock or set the closing time. She was perched on a ladder, rearranging books at the top shelf, and I stood below, holding the bottom stack, my hands hovering in case she dropped one. "Careful," I said, voice lower than I intended. My words floated up to her, and she glanced down, catching my gaze with that same unreadable expression that had haunted me since the first day. "I've got it," she said, brushing past me with just enough proximity that my arm nearly brushed hers. Heat pooled in my chest before I could think, and I had to remind myself to step back, though part of me didn't want to. Her presence, it wasn't loud, wasn't demanding, but it pulled the air around me taut, like a string stretched too far. We worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound her fingers tapping lightly against the wood of the ladder, mine against the book spines. Then she paused, looking down at me with a hesitation I almost didn't catch. "Do you ever think about things you shouldn't?" My throat tightened, heart stuttering. It wasn't a question aimed at me specifically, but the way she lingered on the words felt deliberate, almost dangerous. I wanted to answer honestly, to say yes, and maybe even tell her which thoughts had been keeping me awake at night. But the words caught somewhere between my chest and my lips. Before I could even try, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, eyes narrowing, lips pressed in a thin line. I noticed the faint crease of frustration between her brows. She frowned, then sighed and silenced it. "X, work? A friend checking in?" I didn't ask, didn't need to. The interruption was enough, a reminder that this, whatever this was, wasn't mine to claim. The ladder creaked as she shifted, bringing her closer to the edge of my space. My pulse jumped, and I could feel the heat of her coat against my arm. I wanted to lean in, wanted to let my hand brush hers, wanted to see if she'd flinch or linger, but I froze. Because even if she wanted it, the world outside these walls wasn't ours to bend. She tilted her head, studying me, and for a heartbeat, the rain, the shelves, the dim light, all of it fell away. There was something in her eyes, a quiet questioning, a pull I couldn't name. I wanted to speak, to reach, to touch, but the weight of restraint pressed down on me, heavier than any ladder or stack of books. She stepped down, carefully, brushing past me again. The tip of her sleeve grazed my hand, just long enough to leave a spark, short enough to make me ache. I swallowed, unsure whether I'd imagined it, or if it had been real. And then she was gone, ladder folded, rain still tapping, leaving me gripping a book like it could anchor me against the storm she'd stirred inside me. I wanted to move, to call her back, to close the gap, but I didn't. All I could do was stand there, hand tingling, heart insisting it wasn't over, knowing I was dangerously close to the edge. The bookstore was empty, the lights dimmed to a soft amber that made the stacks of books look like they were holding their breath. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, eyes distant. I had been restocking a shelf nearby, but I couldn't focus, couldn't stop stealing glances at her, at the way her jaw tightened when she exhaled, at the way the lamplight caught the silver in her hair. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you ever feel like you're just performing?" Her voice was low, uneven, like she wasn't sure if she wanted an answer or just to hear herself speak. I froze for a second, unsure how to respond. "Performing?" I asked cautiously, taking a small step toward her. She didn't move. "Everything," she said, and her gaze found mine. It was sharp now, searching. "Work, people, smiling when you don't want to, pretending you're okay when you're not. I'm tired of it." Her fingers pressed against the counter, knuckles whitening. I wanted to say something reassuring, something that would make her feel less alone, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just stood there, hands loosely at my sides, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the tension in her shoulders. It was impossible to look away. She let out a short laugh, almost bitter, and shook her head. "And now there's you," she said, voice softer, almost a whisper. My stomach twisted. Her eyes weren't accusing, but they weren't neutral either. They were full of a complicated kind of honesty that made me ache in places I didn't know existed. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer, careful not to close the space too quickly. She exhaled slowly, eyes flicking down, then back up. "You're not like everyone else here. You notice things. You see things I don't let anyone else see. And I don't know if I like it or if it's dangerous." Her lips parted, and for a moment she seemed younger, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but I stopped. The air between us was too charged, too raw. Instead, I just nodded, swallowed, and said, "I see you." Not the words I wanted, not enough, but honest. She let that hang in the air, silence stretching long enough that I thought the world had stopped. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against the edge of the counter. She didn't close her eyes. She just stayed there, quiet, letting the moment stretch between us. I wanted to say something more, anything, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was watch the faint rise and fall of her shoulders, the subtle trembling of her fingers. Then she lifted her head, eyes glistening with something she wasn't saying. "I'm scared," she admitted, barely audible. "Scared of what I'm feeling, and scared of what it could mean if I let it go any further." I swallowed hard, heart hammering. There was no solution here, no easy fix, just the weight of unspoken truths, of something fragile and dangerous building between us. And then she turned and walked toward the door, voice just a whisper over her shoulder. "I don't know if I can do this without breaking." It was late, the bookstore nearly silent except for the hum of the old heating unit. I was stacking a few stray paperbacks when she appeared, leaning against the doorway like she'd just walked out of a memory she couldn't shake. Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her bag, twisting it, untwisting it, as if the motion could steady her thoughts. "I found something," she said quietly, holding a small, worn notebook. She looked at me, eyes hesitant, and for a second I didn't move, afraid I'd break whatever fragile thread had brought her here. "What is it?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She opened it carefully, turning the pages as if they held the weight of her entire life. "It's old. From a long time ago. I haven't looked at it in years." Her fingers lingered over the inked words, trembling slightly. I lost him, and I thought I'd forgotten, but..." Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard. I didn't know what to say. The bookstore felt smaller, the light dimmer. All I could do was stand there, trying to make myself small enough to be invisible, but close enough to notice the little tremors in her hands, the way her jaw clenched, the brief flicker of tears she refused to shed. She began again. voice barely audible. I loved him. And then he just left. No explanation. Nothing. She shook her head, lips pressed together, eyes down. I've carried it longer than I realized. Something in me tightened. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that she wasn't broken, that she could let it go. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I could see it. The way she buried her grief, the way she hid it behind her confidence, her calm, her almost imperceptible humor. And I wanted her to know that I saw it. Without words, without judgment. I knelt beside her, careful to stay quiet. You're not carrying it alone, I said softly. The words felt small, inadequate, but somehow necessary. She looked at me then, really looked, and I could see the years of guarded strength cracking at the edges. She exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and closed the notebook with deliberate care. I've never shown this to anyone, she admitted. Not even my closest friends. I thought maybe I couldn't. I see you, I whispered, the words sticking to my throat. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an invitation. Just observation. A recognition. She gave a short, almost ironic laugh, and then the smallest, quietest smile tugged at the corner of her lips. You're different, she said, eyes glimmering with something I couldn't name. Vulnerability. Recognition. Relief. Maybe all three. I wanted to reach out, wanted to hold her hand, but I stayed still, because some moments aren't about action, they're about being present, being seen, being quiet. When she finally stood, notebook clasped to her chest, she lingered at the edge of the shelf, just close enough for me to notice the faint brush of her sleeve against mine. My fingers tingled long after she'd stepped back, and I realized this small, almost imperceptible connection had shifted something inside me. Something seismic, though soft. Something I couldn't ignore. The bookstore smelled of old paper and rain, a quiet cocoon from the world outside. She was seated in the corner, knees tucked against her chest, the notebook from last night lying open on her lap. I hadn't meant to linger, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Somehow, the space between us had become impossible to ignore. She glanced up, catching me watching, and didn't look away. Not with suspicion, not with distance, just recognition. It was strange how something so simple could feel like a confession. You stayed, she said softly. A statement, not a question. I couldn't leave, I admitted. My voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the hum of the heater. There was no drama here, no cinematic declaration, just two people noticing, really noticing, each other. We didn't speak for a long while. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate, heavy with unspoken understanding. I could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers brushed the edge of the notebook like she wasn't sure if she belonged anywhere else. And I could feel it. The pull that had been growing since that first brush of hands over tea jars, since the rain-soaked evenings of hesitation. I edged closer, careful not to startle her, and sat on the floor opposite her, just far enough to respect the space she seemed to need, close enough to share the quiet. The words we might have said hung unspoken, hovering like dust in the amber light. Her eyes found mine again. No barriers this time. Only the subtle vulnerability of someone who had carried too much and was finally allowing herself a small reprieve. I reached out, slowly, deliberately, and my fingers brushed hers. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let her hand rest against mine, light, almost tentative, like testing if this new gravity was safe. My chest lifted in that brief contact. The weight of years, of fear, of everything unspoken, settled into something warmer, something grounded. We stayed like that, hand in hand, neither speaking, the storm outside reduced to a soft patter against the windows. Time seemed suspended, measured only in breaths, in the faint rise and fall of her chest, in the gentle squeeze of our fingers. And then, without any grand gesture, without any words of commitment or promise, she leaned slightly, just enough for her shoulder to rest against mine. Not a declaration, not a demand, just acknowledgement that, somehow, this, us, made sense. I felt the small exhale of her breath, the tiniest shift in weight, and knew that nothing else needed to be said. No confessions, no labels, Only the quiet understanding that had grown between us, patient, earned, inevitable. Her gaze lingered on mine for a moment longer. Then she lowered her eyes, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I returned it, squeezing her hand just a fraction, a silent agreement that we were here, together, in this fragile, imperfect present. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the bookstore held its breath. And for the first time, neither of us wanted it to end. I still remember the quiet of that evening, the way the bookstore smelled like rain and paper, the way her hand fit against mine like it had always belonged there. It wasn't fireworks or grand confessions, and it wasn't meant to be. It was something quieter, something earned, two people finally allowing themselves to exist in the same space without pretense. Since then, I've noticed the small shifts, not in the world around us, but in ourselves. She moves with a fraction less caution, a tiny release in her shoulders, a softening in her gaze that wasn't there before. I catch her looking at the corners of a room, or pausing mid-step, and I know she's thinking about moments we've shared, about trust, about letting herself be seen. For me, it's different too. I'm slower to speak, maybe more deliberate, but I listen differently, notice differently. I've learned that attraction isn't always about the thrill or the chase. Sometimes it's in the quiet acknowledgement of someone else's weight. The way their presence can make your own life feel more grounded, more real. Love, I've realized, isn't always a declaration. Sometimes it's a hand held in silence, a forehead leaning briefly against yours, a shared moment that doesn't need labels to exist. Sometimes it's the understanding that the person across from you has been carrying burdens you may never fully know, and that letting them lean on you is enough. We've both changed. She laughs more easily, though quietly, a sound that reaches places I didn't know could feel warmth. I speak less, maybe, but I notice more, and I don't take her presence for granted. The gap of years, the quiet hesitation, the almosts and the interruptions, all of it has shaped something fragile and beautiful that I don't want to rush, don't want to spoil. And in that, I've learned something about myself too. Patience, maybe, or humility, or the courage to be present without demanding more than the moment offers. There's freedom in that kind of love, the slow, steady kind, built on observation, trust, and mutual care. I sometimes find myself thinking about her hands, the way they move, the small touches that linger in memory. But it's no longer a pang or a yearning, it's recognition. Proof that the moments we've shared are ours, private and unhurried, and that even in silence, we are speaking. I don't know exactly what tomorrow will bring or the days after that, but I do know that when I glance at her across a room, when our fingers brush lightly, or when she laughs softly at something I say, I feel the gravity of a connection that doesn't need explanation. That's enough. And maybe that's the point. That love doesn't always have to be dramatic or perfect. Sometimes, it's the quiet after the storm, the simple comfort of someone who finally sees you and lets you be seen in return. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?